Welcome to Psyched for Psychology, a Nystrom & Associates podcast. Our hosts, Michelle Iverson and Brett Cushing, are both licensed marriage and family therapists at Nystrom & Associates. Each week, they talk about all things mental health and therapy, and you get a chance to dive into specific psychology topics that help promote personal development and wellness. And now, here are your hosts, Michelle and Brett.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Psyched for Psychology. My name is Brett Cushing.
And I'm Michelle Iverson, and thank you so much for joining us today. Episodes for our podcast will be released weekly on Tuesday mornings. You can email us at podcast@nystromcounseling.com. We want to hear all of your feedback and comments and love to hear future ideas for upcoming episode topics that you'd be psyched to hear us talk about.
So today we are psyched to talk to you about depression. Now that sounds kind of like an oxymoron.
Sounds like an oxymoron.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah, we are excited. Yeah, because it's something that affects very many of us. And I don't know about you, Michelle, I get frustrated sometimes. People say, I'm just really depressed, because they're bored. Maybe they're depressed because things just haven't been going well for them. And what they're really saying is I'm down, I'm kind of down in the dumps. And so there's this term depression that's used for lots of different experiences that people are having. And we're going to be talking about what really is depression.
Right.
How do we deal with it? How do we get over it?
Clinical depression.
Absolutely. So depression, it's really, it's a very common mental disorder. And globally, it's estimated that 5% of adults will suffer from depression or are suffering currently from depression. And it's the leading cause of disability worldwide and is a major contributor to the overall global burden of disease. So we can see depression is quite serious. It doesn't just mean I'm having the blues. This is very debilitating. We're going to see, as we're seeing already, that many people suffer from this. And I think we talked before about anxiety is kind of like a gateway into other types of disorders and problems for us. And depression, as I was just talking about here, can also be a gateway into other disease. So it's very relevant. I'm sure many of us have come across somebody who's experienced it, and we don't really know what to do with it a lot of times. And really, I think we don't even know what it is.
Right. And that's the big thing. Like, how do therapists know when something is truly that clinical depression? And it's really hard when we have people coming into our offices and telling us things like, I just can't focus, right? My brain feels really foggy. I used to do and love and enjoy all these things, and now I just kind of feel blah. For some people, they might overlook that. They might not see those as being potential indicators and signs that that person is not just experiencing a day of low mood, that it's become a pattern. That's what we're really looking for. We're looking for a pattern, signs showing us that that person is experiencing a mood disorder. We're going to be looking for things like ongoing, persistent sadness. We're going to be looking for something called anhedonia. So that's just fancy clinical medical term for something a lot of people with depression have experienced, where they used to have all these things they really enjoyed in their life, and they can't find enjoyment in that anymore. We're going to be looking at how, what's been going on with your emotions, with your thoughts, with your behaviors even. Even we might be looking at things like, how's your sleep? How's your eating? All of those things, and seeing major changes and disruption in those things can be potential symptoms and warning signs of depression. And of course, we want to see whether any of that is having a significant disruption in your life, in your work, in your school, in your relationships, and at home. There are actually two types of depression. There is something called major depression. These have a shorter time span, but tend to be more debilitating for the people experiencing it. And there is something, it used to be called dysthymia. It's now called persistent depressive disorder. This is technically considered to be less severe, but it is more chronic. It is much more longer lasting, with fewer times of getting some relief. So even though technically less severe in some ways, it can still be debilitating in other ways too.
Right. And one of the distinctions between major depression, as you talked about, and persistent depressive disorder is the duration and the intensity. Mm-hmm. So with that major depression, we have oftentimes suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts that can be passive, like, oh, I just wish I was dead, or nobody would notice if I wasn't here. Or we can have active, which is like much more serious. We're having a plan. We're having maybe thoughts that are very specific towards suicide. Whereas with persistent depressive disorder, it's not always characterized with that intensity of those suicidal thoughts. It is something I think that when we hear about depression, I don't know about you, I often have the character Eeyore in mind from Winnie the Pooh, and I think a lot of people do.
Yes.
And while that can be true, I have appreciated, I've seen on social media, people will show signs of people who have depression, and they show people laughing.
Right.
And it looks like they're having a great time. And I think there's an old proverb that says laughter hides a heavy heart. And so I think it's really important that people, when we're talking about depression, we understand that it can manifest itself even in laughter, because laughter is a way we hide all of this pain that's going on.
Absolutely. We hear that all the time, where we get examples of times of, well, so-and-so seemed to be having a great day. How could they possibly have depression? And it's because the depression is deeper than that, right? We're getting below the surface. We're really getting an understanding of what is going on in terms of that person's thoughts and emotions on a day-to-day basis.
And a lot of times we not only fool the outside world, we fool ourselves.
Sometimes we do.
Yeah. And it's really important that we're honest with ourselves. It takes a lot of courage to admit this, that we have it. And because with it is the sense of powerlessness. And really, I want to touch on that idea of powerlessness, because a lot of people think, well, just cheer up. You know, you have these people and that do self-help kind of things that will tell us, well, you just need to go and you need to conquer the day, and you know, you can have your best life now, and you can do all these things. And it assumes all of this power and control that we have. And yet people with depression, clinical depression, don't have that power. And it is frustrating for people who are living with them, because you want to say, well, just get out of bed or just get moving or try to do something. And it's more than just the symptoms. There are these medical issues in relation to the brain and how the brain is functioning, and the chemical imbalance in the brain and serotonin levels and such, so that people are unable to do something they normally would have been able to do had their brain chemistry been more in balance.
Right.
So it's not a matter of just saying, hey, come on, cheer up. Don't worry, be happy. It's actually, that can compound a lot of depression for people, because if anybody wants to get out of depression, it's the person that's depressed.
Right. So what you're saying is people don't choose to be depressed. That's not a thing. It's
right. Yeah, people don't. And it can look like, and it can appear that they're just playing the victim role. Yeah, I think that's how a lot of people look at people with depression, as, oh, they're just playing the victim card. And I get that. I understand, and we don't want people to avoid responsibility. But that's how it can look with depression. That's not what is happening for people that are truly clinically depressed. Most people with depression, they will feel better with medication and with psychotherapy, oftentimes with both. And it's not something they can just snap out of.
Exactly. And we see a lot of kids and teenagers coming in, I feel like more and more, especially after the pandemic, with depression. Kids who have parents with depression are genetically potentially predisposed and being at greater risk of also having depression themselves. Depression really affects all ages, all genders, but with some of the research, girls have been more likely to end up developing depression during adolescence. There is research that shows that depression is a risk factor for suicide. As many as 2 to 3% of kids ages 6 to 12 and 6 to 8% of teenagers could have serious depression. So we're looking at about 2.8 million adolescents, 12 to 17 in the U.S., having at least one major depressive episode in 2014. So that's a 2014 statistic.
I can't imagine it's gotten any better since 2014.
Absolutely not. Very likely worse. And 80% of kids who have an anxiety disorder, and then 60% with depression, they're not getting treatment. And I think a lot of it tends to be because of a lot of the stuff that we talked about. A lot of people thinking that, maybe this is just, I see a lot of they're just being a normal teenager. They're just a normal moody teenager.
Right.
But oftentimes it's not the case. And there's something more going on.
Right. And imagine saying to somebody who has diabetes and saying to the person, well, just regulate your sugar better.
Yeah. Let me just tell you, just do it on your own. No help, no medication.
Come on, just get over it. Or somebody that has insomnia. Well, just go to sleep. Mm-hmm. Right?
Right.
How insulting that is. And again, we talked about this before in other podcasts, how our desire to be in control, it really drives how we relate to people. And so we see people who are depressed and we can't control it. Mm-hmm. And what does that do? It drives us even harder to try and control the other person. Doesn't help the person who's dealing with that kind of depression. Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about symptoms. You alluded to this earlier as you defined depression, clinical depression. Although depression can occur only once during a person's lifetime, people typically have multiple episodes. And during these episodes, the symptoms occur most of the day, nearly every day. And it's going to include a number of things. You talked about anhedonia, this loss of pleasure in life. It has no meaning, no pleasure. And that can be hard for people who, if you're feeling that about your life, and that includes even your loved ones. Mm-hmm. And in a way, it's not that you don't love them, you just don't have any feeling for that. It's just almost like indifference. But there's these feelings of sadness, crying episodes, a sense of this emptiness and hopelessness, also a sense of low motivation. Mm-hmm. I really want to underscore that one. People who are depressed have very low motivation. And you're going to see people who are clinically depressed are going to have angry outbursts, irritability, frustration, even over small issues that seem kind of trivial. They can become very big issues for them as well. And then adding to that loss of interest or pleasure, there's the normal activities such as sex or hobbies or sports, even their faith, their spirituality, all of things that were really once important and that maybe they were passionate about, they're just really indifferent about now as well. What do you think? Can you think of any other symptoms maybe that would apply to depression?
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about depression, I think about a lot of people coming in feeling a lot of feelings of feeling worthlessness, feeling guilt, being really, really fixated on my failures in the past, blaming myself. We hear a term a lot about depression being very focused in the past and anxiety being very focused in the future. Yeah. We see a lot of past concerns being brought up in therapy that are contributing to a lot of the depression symptoms occurring, especially when it comes to feeling like they've let themselves or their family down.
Good point.
We see a lot of and when we think about this is a chemical issue in the brain. We're going to see other areas of the brain being affected too. We're going to see concerns with thinking, processing, concentration, making decisions, and remembering things. Often seeing a very, very drastic change before the depression started to how their brain functions now. We talked about seeing those recurrent thoughts of death, of suicidal thoughts, seeing different, just sometimes it's like an unexplained kind of physical issue that maybe they've gone to the doctor, had it checked out, but they couldn't really find anything wrong going on. Sometimes it ends up being related to depression and shows up as headaches or back pain, especially for a lot of people who might come from a culture where there isn't a lot of language for depression and mental health. We end up talking about things like the physical pain they experience, and it ends up being a part of their depression. And for a lot of people, those symptoms are severe to cause problems, and it interferes with their day-to-day life. And also sometimes people, they just can say, all I can tell is just, I'm miserable, I'm unhappy, and often I really don't know why.
Right. And it can be very frustrating for that person and others who are living with that person because, well, what are you upset about? Or what are you so depressed about? Or what would make you feel better? And there's just usually a shrugging of the shoulders and saying, I don't know. And so hopefully people are seeing in these symptoms, people maybe in your life or yourself where you've experienced this and this sense of powerlessness that goes along with this and gives us hopefully some compassion as we gain understanding. One area I think we can also develop more compassionate understanding in relation to depression is children and teens when they're experiencing this. So there are common signs and symptoms of depression in children and teenagers that are similar to those of adults, but there also can be some differences. So with the younger children, those kiddos, their symptoms of depression may include sadness and irritability. They also could be much more clingy. They're holding on more. They don't like to be alone. It could look like anxiety a bit too, but there's that clinginess and a lot of worry. Also, they'll express and relate pains and aches that are going on inside that are just really not explainable by any kind of physiological, impetus for that. Refusing to go to school. Again, there's that low motivation, and that's how that might manifest itself. It might look like they're just trying to get out of school. They're complaining. And then also being underweight, also overweight. You can go both ways. People and kids can put on weight. They can lose weight during these times. I think when I'm not clinically depressed, I'm a little more prone to putting on weight than losing. And it all depends on how we're coping with this.
Yeah. Teenagers tend to have a little bit more of that vocabulary to share a little bit more about what they're thinking and feeling. And so we might see for teenagers a little bit more of those signs of them saying, I'm feeling sad. A lot of irritability. A lot of people don't realize that irritability can be a sign of depression and anxiety, especially for kids and teenagers. They also might be expressing feeling negative, feeling worthless, anger, poor performance or attendance at school, feeling misunderstood if it's a child who you might feel, oh, they're being overly sensitive, really. That could be an indicator of maybe it's not that they're being overly sensitive, it's that they're struggling with these internal thoughts and feelings that are linked to depression. If we start to see substance misuse with kids, again, eating or sleeping too much or even too little. If we're seeing insomnia or this kid is sleeping in like suddenly 16 hours a day, we'd want to take a closer look at that. Self-harm, loss of interest in their normal activities, and avoiding social situations, especially, again, if that's a pretty drastic change for that person.
And the word you kept bringing up that I think is really helpful, Michelle, is change. Because as I listen to all those symptoms in teens, I think, well, that's what it is to be a teenager, right? They're going to have all of those. And that's because of all the hormonal changes going on within them. We're going to see a lot of these. And I think what you're hitting on is when we see the changes. I mean, drastic changes that are going on. We know that this is more than just typical adolescence, more than just the typical mood swings. When we see this as a pattern and we see this as a drastic change, then we really want to pay a little more attention.
And when we talk to our teenagers about it too, to get their thoughts on it, to approach it from a non-judgmental approach as well too.
That's a whole nother podcast for us right there. Absolutely, I love that. Now, how do I talk to my teen without them saying,
let me jot that one down right now. We're gonna
so
do that
one. Because you have those normal things that are difficult enough, and then you have these other things like anxiety, and you have all the manifestations of anxiety. Then you get depression, and parents are feeling powerless. What do I do? And what do I do to help my kiddo with depression and such? So that's going to be another episode for us. But speaking of episodes, depression has episodes as well. Boy, that was a pretty good transition.
That was a good one. We're going to give Brett credit for that one.
We do have depressive episodes, right? And so during a depressive episode, the person might experience significant difficulty in their personal, family, social, educational, occupational, and other areas that are important to them. So you'll notice I just can't function the way I used to be. Michelle, you talked about that brain fog, and you were talking about that. the manifestations of that brain fog with the other symptoms. And it's just, I can't concentrate, I can't think straight, can't form a good thought. That could be depression, could be lots of things, but we also want to understand that, I'm having a hard time with thinking, with motivation, with performance in each of these areas. So we want to pay attention to this. And we're going to have episodes. A depressive episode can be categorized in 3 ways. They can be mild, they can be moderate, or they can be severe. And that depends on the number and severity of the symptoms people are having, as well as the impact on the individual's functioning. So some people, they can be kind of high functioning. They're going to work and they're just really kind of in this melees where, they have this low motivation, but they're still able to get things done. And these are the people who, you might see them laughing and smiling and it kind of looks like everything's okay. They're just operating in a lower gear, maybe. Then you have people who just absolutely, they can't even get out of bed. And so we want to be aware that we have these different kinds of episodes for depression.
Absolutely. And there's different patterns to those episodes as well, too. So what we're kind of looking for a lot of people is, are they experiencing a single episode? So the first, and for that person, at least up until that point in their life, the only episode where we can very concretely see that they were doing well before, and then hopefully that episode would resolve and they would be doing well after. But for some people, they have recurrent depression. So that means that there are multiple episodes, at least 2, and where that we can again see breaks in between, at least some periods of relief. And if anybody listening is going, well, what about bipolar disorder? Well, we didn't forget about bipolar disorder. Right. That could actually be its own podcast as well, too, because there's a lot that goes into bipolar disorder. But if anybody's kind of curious about that, it is a mood disorder, but we've got depression episodes that end up alternating with periods of mania. There can be a full manic episode or a hypomanic, slightly step below that, where we're going to be looking for periods of not just feeling normal or good, but euphoria, which can sometimes actually end up making the person very irritable, with highly increased activity or energy, but sometimes to the point of where they're sleeping 2-3 hours a night. Other increased symptoms like becoming very talkative, having very racing thoughts, increased self-esteem, but again, sometimes to the point where we're becoming grandiose, and becoming more distracted and more reckless in behavior. This is where we might see potentially psychosis, which is why we might talk about this in a different episode. There can be psychosis that can occur with especially manic depressive episodes with bipolar.
What do you mean by psychosis, just to be clear?
Yeah. Oh, you could get me on a long, long run about psychosis. Psychosis is a collection of symptoms, and it can be attributed to many different things, not just a diagnosis like schizophrenia. But psychosis is just a collection of symptoms that means that that person has experienced some sort of a break with reality. Could be hallucinations, could be delusions. That will be, and at some point we will do an entire podcast episode on this. And we'll be able to show you through the podcast on what it could be like to experience that.
So are you saying that people who are depressed, maybe have major depression, would have psychosis?
That can occur with major depression as well too. That's just a few of those kind of key traits we're looking for bipolar disorder. Sometimes bipolar, that term gets thrown around a lot, especially with this idea of like, well, I'm happy one moment and sad the next, but that's not what that is. We're really looking for really discrete episodes, certain numbers of days even, of how long are we going until we're moving from a depressive to a manic episode.
Important distinctions, I think, right now, as we're looking at depression and talking a little bit about one of the manifestations of it with bipolar, just to try to tease that out. We will talk more about that, but we do want to provide some kind of general overview that provides clarity on this. We also want to provide some clarity on what to do, and because we've talked about how this feels very powerless for those who are suffering from it, for those who are also trying to support somebody who's going through it. What do you think? What do we do, Michelle, to help people?
We think about a lot of things, not just with, therapy and obviously medication for support, but we think about a lot of skills, a lot of coping mechanisms for a lot of people. Sometimes as we are, especially in those initial stages of therapy, we're just looking for some relief for a lot of our clients who are struggling. One form that early on in treatment I might work with for a lot of people to help to start to pull together what can give me some relief. I work with a lot of my clients on creating a coping box. I will use this for kids, teenagers, even adults. And it's about finding a box, and you can decorate it, have fun with it, or it could just be a simple cardboard box. Mm-hmm. And putting in that box anything that we end up coming up with where it's like, this would help me feel better, even if it's just for a moment, even just to get through. And so we might put in fidget toys. We might put in a book, like a coloring book, or like a book that you really, you actually like to read. Putting in any kind of reminders of things to do. If you like to play guitar, put a guitar pick in there, right? Mm-hmm. Something that will remind you, I could grab that thing and have that physical reminder that I could do this right now. And even if it made me feel 5% better, that's going to at least get us started and on our way towards helping with depression.
I really like what you said that's really important in treating depression. You said even if it's going to help just for a little, very brief period of time, because people who are depressed or people who are living with those who are depressed might think, well, what's the purpose of just this little bit of positive experience for a little while? I'm just going to go back to being depressed again. And think about that. If we took that mentality towards charging our phones, well, if I'm at the airport and I have 10% left in my battery, I think, well, why charge it, for another 10 minutes? Well, of course I want to charge it for another 10 minutes. I might get another 10% battery. And so it's really important that we're building a positive experience capital, so to speak, that we can draw upon, just like we would with our phones when we're trying to charge those up. So I think that's a really good thing for us to do, very practical, keep trying to build those positive experiences. I also think some things that we can be doing as well is try to do just one thing in the moment. So people, when they're depressed, I know somebody who was depressed and just couldn't get out of his car, sat in his car in a parking lot, was going to go inside to work on some work, and he just couldn't get out of his car. For 45 minutes, he sat there. Yeah. And other people would be thinking, well, just come on, get in there and go to work. You'll feel better. Go have a bagel. And well, the person just couldn't. And so that's how it is for a lot of people who are depressed. And maybe it's just, I can't get out of bed. And so we don't focus on getting out of bed and getting ready. We focus on, I'm going to take the covers off. And then I'm going to swing my feet around to the side of the bed. I'm going to put on my slippers or whatever, my robe, and then I'm going to get up and walk to the bathroom. Yeah. And so we talk about this as sort of one thing in the moment. And we don't think about all of that is involved in getting ready. And we're just living moment by moment by moment. And it sounds like we're moving at a snail's pace. And you notice how laborious this is too. And I think it gives us all a much better appreciation for how difficult this really is for people that are depressed. They literally cannot do some of these things, or they're feeling that. And so what they can do, just these few little things that help them maybe have some positive experience in the moment, and they focus on what's the next thing I need to do right in this moment. What I always tell my depressed clients is I never tell them this. I never say, just be happy. Just feel better. And because they've heard that message from so many people. And I tell them, I'm not going to tell you to be happy. I'm not going to tell you to do anything. I'm going to tell you, if you're depressed, be depressed, just move and keep moving. And that's simple enough, I think, for people to grasp. And it's encouraging enough, because I'm not saying you have to do anything else. Just keep yourself moving.
And what I love about that message, it's in direct opposition, the opposite of what depression would want us to do. If depression's saying to you, stay in bed all day, the first thing we got to do is, what's going to be the exact opposite? I got to find a way to get up and get out and go do something, right?
Yes, that's that opposite to emotion action. We have an urge to, and I like the way you put that, depression is saying, just stay still. Don't do anything. And we have to be, it's a discipline. It's a real discipline to say, I am going to do the opposite of being stationary. And it's a discipline, and it takes a lot of effort just to get out of bed. You hear people say that are depressed. It took so much just to get out of bed this morning. And we look at that, others of us who have not experienced depression, we think, come on, give me a break. And yet that's real. We need to validate that and understand this is what's really going on for these people.
Yeah. I've had a lot of people who have been feeling, talking about feeling depressed and feeling angry recently. And we've talked a lot about how it's felt like then I engage in action. And I talk with them about what would be the opposite. How do we engage in action? Actionable things that will help that anger, help that depression, and help you to feel better.
There is hope, and an object in motion tends to stay in motion. And I think depressed people, when they are in motion, they are at least moving in a positive direction. And let's help people figure out, how do I move in a positive direction? How do I get help? When do I get help? Maybe those who are listening who have a loved one that's dealing with this, when do people get help?
Yeah. So when we think about getting help, we really kind of think about too, just obviously as therapists, we want to make sure that people are safe. If you're listening to this podcast today, and if you have for yourself or any people in your life, any worries, concerns about somebody being in immediate danger, immediate crisis, please, we want to make sure people know that 911 is a resource. Even calling your local emergency number and making sure to request, because we understand some people might have some hesitation around that, make sure to request to see if they have a specialized mental health team, because more and more, and hopefully there will be much more resources dedicated to this in the future. A lot of counties, cities have a mental health team that can come to respond. Sometimes it's a social worker, sometimes it's a police officer that's been specially trained, that can come and are really, really wonderful and skilled at helping to de-escalate, but also just assess for safety and to help that person get to the hospital if they need that immediate help.
And if they need that immediate help, oftentimes it's because the person is suicidal in some way. And so I always tell people, do not transport the person yourself. If someone's actively suicidal, you're thinking, hey, I'm going to take them to the hospital because ambulance costs so much money. But think about that. I mean, the person is emotionally at a place where they're unstable, and then you're in a car, and if they really do want to commit suicide, they're going to just potentially jump out, or they could do something else that's very impulsive. And so call, like you're saying, invite people in who can come and provide the help on site for you. I also want to say, contact other people, contact your family, get other family members there. Contact, if you have a pastor, a spiritual leader, someone else in your faith community, contact them and bring people to you to provide the support that you need.
Yeah. If you need even county crisis, every county has their own crisis team and a crisis number. Oftentimes they operate 24/7 and can get somebody to your home if you need somebody to come to you. Again, a social worker, therapist, somebody who's very well trained and able to help in these situations. But say if somebody's not in immediate crisis, or even if you're not sure, or if that's happening to you yourself, there's so many more resources available to you, again, 24/7. There is the National Suicide Hotline phone number. It's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. You can call them 24/7 and just talk. Oftentimes just talking to someone in those moments can help turn what could be a crisis situation into something that feels much more manageable, and to help you to get through until you can connect with family, friends, or a health professional. That phone number is 1-800-273-TALK. And that's spelled out. It's 1-800-273-8255. If you are a veteran, you can use that same phone number. And when you call, press 1 and you can reach the Veterans Crisis Line. If you're like me and you're not a big fan of talking on the phone, you can text. If you want to text, you can text HOME, HOME, to 741-741. You will reach those same well-trained crisis counselors, and they will be able to text with you and walk you through that situation. And then, of course, call your doctor, call your mental health professional, or call a program like Nystrom, and we can get you connected with somebody soon.
We really hope that today, for those of you who have been suffering from depression, you would experience some validation in this and what it's really like for you. And we hope you're able to connect with this and have some tangible, concrete things you can be doing to help yourself. We also hope that if you're living with somebody or you have a loved one who's suffering from depression, we hope that we've been able to provide insight to you so that you understand better. They're not trying to be difficult. They're not trying to be obstinate. They are suffering. And maybe one of the best things we can do is nothing, in a way, and just crawl down into the dark pit that they're in and just be with them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that feels like I'm doing nothing, and that is everything. And so I encourage you, just with that sense of increased compassion, maybe from the podcast, just sit with them in that dark pit and don't go anywhere. We hope that this has been helpful for those who love people who are suffering from depression and for those who are going through it. Again, we thank you so much for joining us today. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our Psyched for Psychology podcast. We will have new episodes being released every Tuesday morning, and you can find us on any major podcast streaming platform, and you can follow us for our new episodes.
Please email us your comments to podcast@nystromcounseling.com and let us know if you have any ideas for future topics that you'd be psyched to hear us talk about. Again, you can learn more about Nystrom & Associates and all of our available mental health services by going to nystromcounseling.com. Thank you so much for joining. We are psyched to talk to you again soon.
Thank you as always for listening, and please be sure to leave us a review. While this podcast can't be a replacement for therapy, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today and join us again next time. Nystrom & Associates is always available to those who are struggling. If you find yourself in need of support and help, please check us out at nystromcounseling.com.